Hello, and welcome to Ethics Introduction to Ethics. Hello, and welcome to Hello. For the subject of this video, we are going to look into some subjects that philosophers study. We are here for ethics class, and we will spend the bulk of the semester speaking about ethics and looking into ethical issues and ethical theory and so forth. But before we get to ethics, one of the things about the study of ethics is that the very nature of ethics is that it is what we might call a second-tier philosophy. And what we mean by second-tier philosophy is this, that the conclusions that you will reach and the ethical positions that you will take are largely drawn from assumptions that you have made in other areas of philosophy. In other words, other areas of philosophy ask and answer questions that you will assume the answers to before you ever get to the study of ethics, but the answers to those questions will influence the conclusions that you will reach in ethics. So it would be a good thing for us to go back and look at some of the other things that philosophers study so that we can get a better grasp on how our answers to those questions and those topics affect our conclusions in ethics. And not only that, but also it may help us in understanding how other people reach the conclusions that they do. So we're gonna delve right in. So of the various fields that philosophers study, we're gonna look at 4 different fields today. The first one is logic, which is the study of right reasoning; metaphysics, which is the study of being or ultimate reality; epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and how we know the things that we know; and also, and then last but certainly not least, is axiology, and that is the study of value. Ethics is a subcategory of axiology, asking the question or addressing the question of moral value. So we'll look at those 4 briefly during this video, and hopefully give us a little bit of an impetus to study back or think back on, reflect on some of the answers that we might have in these areas. So first of all is logic. Logic, the study of right reasoning. Now, when I say that, people get kind of apprehensive. They're like, well, wait a second, are you going to tell me how to think or what to think? Well, there is a right way to think and a wrong way to think, and logic demonstrates that. Logic is a field that seeks to categorize and see how we think, or how we basically make sense of the world. So anyhow, logic is run off of laws, or logic is Logic will be the first area of study that we look at. Logic is the study of right reasoning. The study of right reasoning. Did you know that there is a right way to think and a wrong way to think? And logic helps us figure out what that right way to think and wrong way to think is. So anyway, logic... The first area of philosophy that we'll look in today is that of logic. And logic is the study of right reasoning. The study of right reasoning. With logic implies that there is a right way to think and a wrong way to think. Logic is a study of the rules or the laws that we follow whenever we do think, or whenever we talk, when one rational human being communicates with another. There are certain laws that we all assume, and yet even though we assume them, sometimes we don't think that we're using them. But we do. We follow these laws of logic. For example, there's the law of identity. The law of identity. And the law of identity simply states that a thing is what it is. In other words, A equals A. A thing is what it is. When we talk about the law of identity implies that things have meaning. And whether the meaning, whether or not we use the same word for it, things have meaning. For example, in English, we would call a dog a dog, and that same word dog might take other words or other symbols to stand in the place of that word. Nevertheless, the term dog means dog. It literally means that animal that sort of pops in your mind when you say the word dog. There is meaning behind that term. Everything has an identity, and that identity implies that a thing is what it is and is not what it is not. And that kind of leads us to the second law of logic, and that is the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction says that a thing cannot be both itself and not itself at the same time in the same sense. The thing cannot be both itself and not itself at the same time in the same sense. The idea here is, for example, that my chair cannot be both my chair and not my chair in the same time in the same sense. That would be a contradiction. And contradictions cannot exist in reality. They can only exist abstractly. That's what the law of non-contradiction would imply. That there cannot be actual contradictions in the real world. There can only be contradictions in our mind, contradictions in our thinking, contradictions in abstract concepts. So if I were to say, for example, God exists and yet God does not exist, that would be a contradiction. So long as what I mean by exist remains the same as between the two statements. If I were to say God does exist, then that would imply that the possibility of God not existing is excluded. If I were to say that God does not exist, then that would imply that the possibility of God existing is excluded. The two cannot be both. They cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. Now, somebody might come along and they might say, for example, well, I believe that God exists for those who believe in him as a principle by which they are encouraged, they are given inspiration, they are given meaning in their life, but God doesn't have a separate existence like my car exists or my dog exists. Now, and so that person is trying to find a middle ground to make both statements true. But see, what has taken place here is if a person says God exists in this sense but not in this sense, what we've really done, or what that person has really done, is that they have changed the definition of what it means to exist between the two statements. They have not found a way to harmonize the contradiction in the statement that God does exist and that God does not exist. So the law of non-contradiction prevents that. So there's the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and then there's also the law of the excluded middle. And the law of the excluded middle basically says that a statement is either true or false. It cannot be both. It's either true or false. The middle ground is excluded. There can't be a synthesis of the two. It's an either or proposition. So that would be the law of the excluded middle. So logic, communication, mathematics, all of them operate on these basic laws of logic. So that if I were to try to deny the law of identity, for example, I would have to invoke the law of identity. And that's what really makes, that really is what makes laws of logic laws, because you cannot deny them without invoking them. For example, if I said the law of identity is not true, well, what have I done? I've identified the law of identity. I've named it. I've created a term that names the law of identity, and that in and of itself invokes the law of identity. And when I've said it's not true or it doesn't apply, then basically what I've done is that I've invoked also the law of non-contradiction, because what I have said is the law of identity isn't true, and that would contradict a statement that says that it is true. And so I'm invoking them, I'm assuming them, and that would demonstrate that those things are true, that the laws of logic are true. I cannot try to even begin to refute them without using them and assuming their truthfulness and their trustworthiness. So that's how we know that the various laws of logic are laws of logic. You cannot invoke them or you cannot deny them without invoking them. So that's logic. Now there are also fallacies of logic, and we're not going to get too much into that in this course. It is a fascinating study, but basically, fallacies of logic are places where logical argumentation goes wrong. You can look those up and Google them and find all kinds of different types of fallacies that people use. Very entertaining reading sometimes, actually. But the next thing that we'll look at that philosophers study is the field of metaphysics. The field of metaphysics. So we've got logic, which is the study of right reasoning. We've got metaphysics. And metaphysics is the study of being and ultimate reality. The study of being and ultimate reality. The study of existence. The study of things that exist and what is the nature of the world in which we live. So metaphysics is the study of being an ultimate reality. Some questions that metaphysics addresses, the field of metaphysics addresses. The first one is simply, does God exist? Does God exist? And metaphysics asks this question because ultimately metaphysics is seeking to get at the ground of reality. What is underneath it all? Or is it just matter plus time plus space plus energy? Is there some sort of existence outside of this material reality that we live in? What is the nature of reality, and how does it cohere together? What relationship do things in reality have to one another, and so forth? So metaphysics is the question of being or reality. Now think about this. Think about this and how this might have an impact on the study of ethics, for example. So one of the first questions of metaphysics is, does God exist? Now, the answer to that question is not one that a person can put off. That's a question that you have to answer. William James, a pragmatist philosopher, calls this a live question. It's one that you can't put off, because to avoid answering it is actually to practically follow one side or the other. So if a person says, well, I don't know if God exists, well, that's all well and good. They can reason that they have this middle ground abstractly in their mind, but in reality, they're going to live as if either God does exist or as if God doesn't exist. They're going to try to live one way or the other. They can't put the question off. The practical implications of it are far too great. So does God exist? Now, we all, rolling out of bed in the morning, assume an answer to that question. For those who believe that God does exist, they're gonna order their day and order their priorities based on what priorities they believe are that God would advance, that He would care for. If a person rolls out of bed in the morning and they don't believe that God exists, they're gonna order their priorities and order their day and choose to do the things that they're doing based on the assumption that God doesn't exist, that they don't have anybody to answer to. And so they're going to live one way or the other, whether or not they actually have an articulated answer to the question. So does God exist? Now, think about how that answer to that question would affect your approach to ethics. For the person that believes that God does exist, they are probably going to look to get their understanding of ethics based on what? Based on the existence of God, or belief in the existence of God. If a person doesn't believe in God, they're going to try to get their ethics from some other means. Based on the non-existence of God, maybe they're going to try to use human reason or empirical verification or something like that. Whereas the person who believes in God is going to look to see what God believes is, and what God tells them is right or wrong. So the methodology, the answer to that one question is going to dramatically affect our methodology of doing ethics. We'll see that as time goes on. Then we ask our question. Another question that metaphysics asks, rather, is the question of what is reality actually made of? I alluded to this just a moment ago. Is reality made of matter, time, space, and energy, the material realm? Or is there a supernatural spiritual realm, a realm of the mind that exists outside of this material realm, but that might have an impact on it? So that's another question that is asked. And think about the implications of the answer to that question to ethics. Because if we're looking for moral value, if we're looking for things like that, then the implication here is that if there is a world that exists outside of the world that we live in, then that may be where we need to go to find true and ultimate meaning and value. That might be the place that drives our ethical imperatives. That might be the place that determines what we are to think about ethics. Whereas if the world is only matter, time, space, and energy in a closed system, then we are more or less free to engage in the pursuit of ethics on earthly terms, right? So again, this is one of those questions that a person is going to assume the answer to before they even get into ethics, and they may not have considered it deeply. They might not have articulated the reasoning behind their choice, but they will assume the answer to it. Another major question in metaphysics that will dramatically affect what conclusion you're able to reach in ethics is the question of whether or not human choices are actually free. Are human choices actually free? Because if we live in a world that is just a big gigantic machine, then our choices are predetermined, even if we don't feel like they are. It may very well be that we just don't know all the inputs that would predict our behavior, and if we did have all those variables locked down, we might be able to draw a conclusion about how we might choose in a given situation, and that choice might be predetermined by some feature of the universe, without us actually feeling like it is. But if human choices are if human choices are determined, they are not free, then what does that do with the notion of accountability when it comes to, say, criminals? Because don't we believe, ethically speaking, that in order for a person to be responsible, morally responsible for their choices, for the actions that they do, that they had to have had a choice in that action to begin with? That seems to be fairly obvious, or fairly obvious to us, because if a person doesn't have a choice in the matter, then we don't hold them morally accountable. Now, we might try to work a system whereby they aren't forced into that decision again, right? But we wouldn't hold them morally responsible if they didn't have a choice in doing the thing that they did. Conversely, if human beings do have freedom of choice, then it's very easy to see how they would be morally accountable. However, the problem therein lies this is the problem that we're dealing with, though. If the world that we live in is only matter, time, space, and energy, a material universe enclosed in a closed system, then there's really no room for freedom. Because everything that we see in this universe has a cause. Every action, every event, every phenomenon that we see has a cause to it, an antecedent cause. We can trace behavior back to certain inputs, and we can trace certain motions back to what made it move. So why does the tire in the car move? Well, it's driven by the axle. Why does the axle move? Well, it's driven by the transmission and the gears in the transmission. Well, why does the transmission move? It's driven by the engine. Why does the engine move? Well, the combustion of small explosions driving pistons that turn a crank, that's what drives the engine to move. Well, why did that happen? Well, somebody turned the key in the ignition, and so on and so on and so on. We can trace all of that motion all the way back like a set of dominoes. One domino falls over, causes the next one to fall over, and so on and so on. Everything that we see in the universe that we live in seems to have an antecedent cause, a cause that came before it. Well, if that's the case, then why should we assume that human behavior is any different? Why should we assume that human choices are any different? I mean, after all, we're just biochemical machines. And if we have the right inputs, then those right inputs will coalesce and necessitate a certain behavior. So it would seem that in order for there to be a freedom of choice, there has to be something outside of this materialistic universe in a closed system. There has to be something out there that would account for freedom. for the existence of human freedom, which would then give us the ability to hold people morally responsible. So those are just a few of the questions, but we can see how all of those questions in metaphysics impact how and what we're able to do in ethics. And these are questions that these are answers that we just assume before we ever come to the table when it comes to ethics. Metaphysics, logic. The next area of philosophical inquiry that we'll look at is that of epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and how we know what we know. The study of knowledge and how we know what we know. Now, epistemology has various, I guess, disciplines of study in it. Different people who will say that knowledge is this, or we get our knowledge from this place, or we get our knowledge from that place, and this is the best way that we can know the things that we know. But all of those fields, if we ask each one of them individually, would probably agree that a good working definition of knowledge is this: knowledge is a belief that you have that is also true in the real world, and that you are justified holding it. Right? It's a belief that you have that is also true in the real world, and that you are justified in holding that belief. Let me give you maybe a bit of an example or an illustration on this. So knowledge begins with a belief, but I think we would all agree that not everything that we believe counts as knowledge. Not everything that everybody believes counts as knowledge, because there are people who believe contradictory things, and those both can't be true. Right? So just because somebody believes something to be true doesn't mean that they know it's true. Those two are two different things. Well, what's the difference between them? Well, knowledge, not only do you have to believe it, but it also actually has to be true in the real world. So that's another requirement of something in order for it to be called knowledge. Because if you believe something and that something is actually not true, then you don't really have knowledge. You don't have knowledge. So, for example, if I believed let's say that I believe in the flying spaghetti monster. That's what I believe in. That's my belief. And let's say, just for the sake of argument, that the flying spaghetti monster doesn't actually exist. Well, then my belief is not called, while it still may be a belief, it cannot be called knowledge rightly. Because if I believe something that is not true, then I'm wrong, and I don't have knowledge of the truth. So you have to believe it, and it has to be true in the real world. Now, I might have a belief in the myth of the flying spaghetti monster, but if the flying spaghetti monster doesn't in fact exist, then I don't have knowledge of him. Okay, so knowledge requires a belief on the one hand, and it requires that belief to actually be true. But there are times where just because you believe it, and just because it actually happens to be true by coincidence, doesn't mean that you're justified in holding the belief that you do. For example, if I were to tell you that my sister-in-law, who lives in Chicago, is pregnant, and let's say that you know my sister-in-law, and I come to you one day and say, "Hey, guess what? I believe that my sister-in-law who lives in Chicago, she's pregnant." And let's just say that you happen to have gotten on Facebook earlier this morning, and you found out that, yeah, in fact, she was giving an announcement that she was with child. And you're like, "Hey, that's great. That's fantastic. How did you find out about it?" And I'm like, in all of our excitement and everything, I say, "Well, I found out about it because I had a dream about it." And you're like, wait, hold on a second. You mean to tell me that you found out about your sister-in-law expecting a child because you dreamed about it? And I'm like, "Yeah, I dreamed about it." Now, I may believe it to the very core of my being, and it may actually be true that she is with child. But if I don't have a good reason for believing it to be true, then what I have, the belief that I have, can't actually be called knowledge either. I have to have a justified, reasonable reason to believe the belief that I do in order for it to be called knowledge. So it has to be it's a belief, it has to be justified, it has to be true. So we would say that knowledge equals a true justified belief. And that's something that pretty much all philosophers would say, yeah, that would be good. That's a good definition of knowledge. Knowledge is true, justified belief. But how we arrive at that knowledge is where everybody sort of parts ways. For example, there are the skeptics. And the skeptics will say true belief or genuine knowledge is just not possible. And you say, well, what do you mean genuine knowledge is not possible? Well, for the skeptic, they believe that they would readily admit that everybody has beliefs, right? Nobody's going to deny that. I believe things, you believe things, everybody in the world believes something. And you know what? Sometimes the things that we believe are actually true. And so the skeptic would not deny that either. I can believe certain things that are true, and just like you can believe certain things that are true. But here's the problem. We are never justified in saying with absolute certainty that what I believe to be true is actually true. At least that's the skeptic's position. Well, why not? Well, in order for us to know something and know it fully and know it with absolute certainty, then we not only have to know that thing, but we have to know it in relationship to all other things in the world. For example, if we say the sun is a star, the concept of sun and the concept of star are two different things, because we would say that the sun is our sun, right? In other words, it has a relationship to planet Earth that other stars, other celestial bodies don't exactly have. We would call it the sun, and at the same time we would call it a star. But when I look up at noonday, and the blazing sun is shining down on me, I'm not saying, hey, look at that star up there. No, usually when we say, hey, look at the stars, we're talking about something that happens at night, because we see a lot of different stars up in the atmosphere, or in the universe around us. Sorry, atmosphere. Yeah, I'm a geocentrist. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway. So the sun, while it is a star, is known as a sun to us because it's known in relationship to the earth. So in order for us to know something, anything with absolute certainty, or with a greater degree of certainty, we have to know it in relationship to all other things, all other facts, and all other bits of knowledge. And the problem is we simply don't know everything. So since we don't know everything, we can't know anything in relationship to everything. Therefore, our knowledge is somewhat limited. Now, we have certain things that we go, sort of a working provisional knowledge, the skeptic would say, and that's fine. You can do that so long as it works, and no problem. Just like a couple thousand years ago, people were working off of the geocentric model of the solar system, and they believed that everything in the universe revolved around the earth. The sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, the asteroids, the comets. Everything just was in a big circle around the earth, and the earth was stationary in the middle of it all. Well, you know, along came Copernicus and Galileo and others during the 16th century, 15th, 16th, 17th century. And over a period of time, it was demonstrated that model of the universe was false. Now, here's the thing. The skeptic would look at that and they would say, see, there you go. People have been navigating the seas for centuries accurately, just with the geocentric model of the universe. It worked for them. It was a provisional knowledge that accomplished what they wanted it to do, and so it worked for them. And while it worked for them, it was good. When we finally came up with the something actually closer to the truth, though, we can do more things now. We can understand the way that, planetary motion. We can understand gravitation. We can understand all of these things, not only navigation, and we have a greater degree of understanding, but we cannot say that we've arrived at final understanding, right? It's sort of like Newtonian physics getting replaced with Einsteinian physics and so on. All the time. Every time we turn around, the science books are being rewritten because we grow in our knowledge. Well, the skeptic says, see, none of that in the previous editions, none of that was certain. None of that was absolute knowledge. And therefore, since we can't say we know anything with absolute certainty, we need to hold it with an open hand, right? All knowledge claims need to be held with a provisional open hand. We can operate off of the basis of appearances, but we need to hold it with an open hand so that if we need to change theories, we can do that. So those are the skeptics. Another school of thought that's out there are the rationalists. And the rationalists believe that reason is the best source of knowledge, that we can know what we need to know through the exercise of human reason, that we don't have to go and check everything with our eyes and weigh everything and measure everything. We can know the best sorts of things, and the foundation of knowledge can be known through reason alone. We don't have to appeal to our empirical senses. And the father of modern rationalism is a man by the name of René Descartes. René Descartes was a philosopher in the early Enlightenment. He was one of the guys who really got the ball rolling on the Enlightenment period. But you might have heard of him. His philosophy, one of the sayings that he's famous for, is "I think, therefore I am." Now, to give you an example of what rationalism is, right? We'll use this. So Descartes he lived during a period of time where all of the traditional authorities were being challenged significantly. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to provide a foundation, a certain foundation for knowledge, something that we could go and it would be a sure foundation. We can build the edifice of our structure of knowledge on it. And so he thought to himself, what is the best way to do that? Well, the only way to do that, Descartes concluded, was to doubt everything that he could doubt, right? And so he would say, for example, am I sitting in this room? Well, it seems like I'm sitting in this room, but in actuality, this could be just a dream that I'm having. Or it could be sensations and perceptions that are being fed to my brain by some sort of evil demon who's trying to delude me into thinking I'm in this room for whatever reason. And so while I think I'm in this room, while I'm having that experience, I really don't know that my senses are reliable. So I'm going to doubt it, right? And he says, well, can I doubt the existence of my body? And so he'll look at his hand and he'll say, well, I have this immediate sensation of being in my body. So clearly I can't doubt that I'm in my body, right? But hold on a second. When I say I'm in my body, that sort of creates a division between me and my body. If I say I'm in my body, that's a subject-object relationship. So maybe the body that I'm in is not actually my body, or maybe the body that I'm in is another one of these illusions, and my mind is just having this illusion of my body. Maybe I'm a brain in a vat somewhere. Maybe I'm hooked up to the matrix and I don't really even know what's going on, that I'm actually in this body that I think I inhabit. And so he's wringing his hands. He's in this great quandary. What is there? Is there anything that I can't doubt? And then it occurs to him. It occurs to him, wait a second, I'm thinking. In order to doubt, I have to think, right? And so I'm thinking. Thinking is an operation of the mind. It's not an operation of the body, but I'm thinking. Well, here's the thing. In order for me to think, I have to first exist, or else who's doing the thinking? So that was what Descartes meant by I think, therefore I am. What it really saying is I think, therefore I know that I exist, because my thinking presupposes my existence. I have to be here before I can think. And I am thinking. That's what I'm doing. I can't deny it. Therefore, that's something that is absolutely certain. And he builds the entire edifice of knowledge based on that one foundational fact that he is thinking. So that's Descartes, and he's a rationalist, but notice what he didn't do. He didn't look to see that he was thinking. He didn't listen to see that he was thinking. He didn't smell or taste or touch. He invoked no use of his empirical senses in order to determine that he was thinking, or in order to determine he existed. He could have sat in a dark room, and he could have arrived at that just simply by using reason. And so reason, says Descartes and other rationalists, is the best way to come to certainty of knowledge. So those are the rationalists. And then there are the empiricists. The empiricists were ones who believed, who looked at the rationalists, because the rationalists kind of came first. And the rationalists began to propose competing theories with one another. And what was really interesting about the rationalists is by using reason, they were able to arrive at equally contradictory statements of the truth. You'd have one group you'd have Spinoza, for example, saying, well, all of everything is just one unity. And then you would have Leibniz coming along and saying, all of reality is made up of small particles, atoms, or monads is what he would call them. And so in both philosophers had really good reasons for believing what they believed. They were really rational thinkers. In the empiricists, people would look at that and they would say, "Look, these guys can't even come to a conclusion based on reason. So why should we believe them?" So out of out of people's dissatisfaction with rationalists were born the empiricists. And the empiricists are the ones who believe that all knowledge comes to us through our senses. All knowledge comes to us through our senses. Our ability to see or hear or taste or touch or smell, all of those inputs give our minds an understanding of the world around us. And we are born, and our minds are a blank slate. They're a tabula rasa, John Locke would say, for example. And we learn and we come to a knowledge of the world as our sensory experience writes upon that blank slate, so that we can come to a knowledge of the things that exist in the world around us. So those are the empiricists. They're the ones who believe that sense experience is the best source of knowledge. So we've got the skeptics, the rationalists, the empiricists. One other thing that I would mention in epistemology, although there are other theories as well, and you can pick those up if you ever take a philosophy course. But one other thing that I would mention in the way of this is the notion of revelation. Now, revelation as a source of knowledge would simply mean this. It would mean the only way to know with certainty is for knowledge to be revealed to us, or the best source of knowledge is when knowledge is revealed to us. And this is basically when somebody tells us something that we otherwise would not have known. That's what revelation is. Okay, am I there yet? So revelation is when somebody tells us that which we could not have otherwise known. Excuse me. So revelation is when somebody tells us knowledge, when somebody reveals it to us. The best example I would give of this, at least on a person-to-person level, would be something like, the way that I learned algebra was I didn't just sit down with a paper and pencil one day and work my way from basic math to algebra. Algebra was something that I'm not a mathematically inclined person. Algebra is something that somebody had to reveal to me. Somebody had to come along and print a textbook and have a teacher, and they took me through the principles of algebra. So that was something that had to be revealed to me. Well, ethics can be that way as well, can't it? I mean, let's face it, the first source of knowledge of ethics that we ever encounter is that source of revelation. It was our parents, or our teachers, our grandparents, our people way back in the day, in the very earliest time in our lives, taught us about good and bad, taught us about right and wrong. And it's possible that not everything that they taught us was true or good, but that's one of the first sources of knowledge, of ethical knowledge that we ever came by, moral knowledge and things like that. So revelation is an important source of moral knowledge, as we'll see, as time goes on. So skepticism, rationalism, empiricism, and revelation, those are all sources of knowledge. So we've looked at logic, we've looked at metaphysics, we've looked at epistemology, and the last field of philosophical inquiry that we'll look at is that of axiology. And axiology basically is the study of moral value, or the study of value in general. Axiology is the study of value, and there are a couple of different subcategories for that. One of them is aesthetics, which is the study of beauty, and the other would be ethics, and that's the study of moral value, or the study of good and bad, the study of right and wrong. So there's aesthetics and ethics under the category of axiology. Now, for example, in aesthetics, people would ask, is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Certainly there are those who believe that, and there are those artists who believe that beauty is simply a matter of personal opinion. There are others, however, who would believe that there is more of an objective standard to beauty, and while each person might have a personal opinion on what constitutes beauty or ugly, there's more of an objective one that generally most people tend toward, and so forth. But I'll leave that up if you ever want to study aesthetics. But the topic of our class and the topic of our study for the rest of this semester is going to be that of ethics, the study of moral value, the study of right and wrong, the study of good and bad. It's basically taking the philosophical method and applying it to the question of what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, what should be, what should not be, what ought to be, what ought not to be, and so forth. And as we continue through this course, we will investigate those issues. We won't get into it too much here because we're going to spend the rest of the semester talking about that. But those are some of the things that philosophy studies. Now, if we kind of sit back for just a minute and imagine with me. Imagine two different individuals, right? When we come to the topic of ethics, imagine two individuals. The first person believes in God, and they believe that human choices are free. In their epistemology, they put a high priority on the method of revelation. In other words, they believe that what is ultimately good and bad is best taught to them. It's transmitted through cultures and through history. That, for example, since they believe in God, let's say that if this person is a Christian, this person is going to go to the Bible and see that as revelation of God as to what constitutes good and bad, right and wrong, right? So how is that person going to come by their ethics? How are they going to do that? Well, that person is probably going to consult religious authority. Somebody, whether it's a preacher or a church, a tome of revelation such as the Bible, they're going to look into that, and they're going to have to employ their mind, because let's face it, when you're reading a religious tome, sometimes trying to figure out what it is saying to you is a little bit difficult, because it was written in another time, in another language, by a different culture, and trying to distill moral principles out of that and apply it to our own culture takes a little bit of a process. But nonetheless, they're going to consult that religious authority, and that's what they're going to vest their faith or their trust in order to come to the answer to the question of what is right, what is wrong, what is ethical, what is not. Now, that's one person. Now, consider another person, right? This person is an atheist. They believe that humans basically are predestined or predetermined to follow a certain path, because they believe that the universe is a closed system of material, matter, time, space, and energy, and they believe that people are basically machines. And so even though we cannot understand some of the things that they do, basically our lack of understanding is rooted in our ignorance of all of the